Hola amigos, this is Somveer and welcome back to CodePipe. In today's video we will see how we can make an expense tracker using JavaScript. And some of the points that we are going to emphasize on learning today will be class-based approach. In the last video, which was quiz application, we saw what's the importance of class-based approach. In this video we will extend our knowledge by trying to understand the singleton design pattern from OOPS, or commonly known as object-oriented programming. And also we will get to know how we can use the module-based approach when we are making an JavaScript project. We will get to know more about this in the video. So without any delay, let's get started. First of all, let me show you a quick demo of what we are going to achieve. So this is how our expense tracker will look like. This is the summary page. As we can see, we have three tabs here: summary, expenses, and income. This is a very basic tracker and I tried to make it as minimal as possible with some good features like adding charts. So this is a summary where we have budget plan, for what category we have how much budget. Then we have how much we have exhausted from the allocated budget. Then we have charts that indicates the income chart, which is for the income sources, and we have expense chart which shows how much we have used from which category. So this is summary page. Then we have income page where we can add a new income source. Here we can enter the number. Let's say I have 8,000 from YouTube, or we can add a new source if it is not available in the drop down. If we say submit, we can see in our chart that a YouTube salary of 8,000 has been added, and I already had a YouTube of something about 5,000, so this is treated as a new category. Then on the right side we have budget plan. I have already made some categories for food, gift, fuel, miscellaneous, etc. We can delete them or we can add a new budget into our categories. So let's say I want to add an extra budget of 1,000 rupees, so I will add it from here, and on every refresh it goes to summary. So I'll go back to income and I can say that the extra 1,000 is added. Now if I want to delete it, I can say delete and it is gone. Coming back to income again. This is happening because on each of the action I have hard-coded the refresh functionality. So whenever we are refreshing, it is going back to the summary page, which is the home page. So this is something we can work upon, and there is still a bug. Anyways, the last thing we have on the income page is the budget comparison chart. So this is our income, this is our budget, and this can be our projected savings. And here we can say budget is this much for all these categories and estimated savings is this much, which is basically salary minus budget. Next we have expenses. In the expense, it is very basic. We need to add what expense we are doing. So if I want to add an expense of, let's say, 200 rupees from fuel, I can submit it and it will be added to the category expenses. But on the expenses page, you can say the last thing is fuel, 200 rupees. And this is also added in the chart here, which says how much we have exhausted of the total budget. So this is one thing. And lastly, we have a chart which is how much we have used from which category. So let's say for food, I have used 500 amount, for fuel 550, for miscellaneous 100 rupees. So this is basic expense page. And finally, as we have already seen the summary, we have budget plan, category expenses, we have income chart and the expense chart. Quite basic. So let's see how we can implement this. I have my VS Code already set up with the required extensions and everything. I have my folder here is expense tracker. If you want to know how I did the startup, there will be a card on the top right corner. Please have a look. Now, the first thing for every project is taking the requirements. So for that, I will be making a new file which will be logic.txt. This file will basically tell us what we need to do and pretty much how we can do it. So the basic requirements are these. Let me try to explain this. we will have an expense tracker which can add expense manually. Then we can have a functionality of adding a tag on each expense to track it, and by tracking we can see how much we have already used from the allocated budget. Then for budget/income planner, we can have an option of adding income as we have seen. Then we can add budget for a particular category, that also we have seen. And this point and this point are somehow similar. In the income planner, we will create budget categories, and in the expense tracker, we will see how much from that created budget we have exhausted. So these can be interrelated, we can say. And finally, we will have a summary page, which will be a kind of dummy thing, but it will give us all the information about incoming and outgoing money in the month, or maybe the expense tracker as we have seen. We can also list out some challenges that we are going to face. So in this project, I have faced the challenge of graphs and how we can show the information in a chart or a bar graph kind of thing. So that can be a challenge. After this, let me structure my HTML file. So I will make a new file with index.html. Using some shortcuts, I can say HTML and get some basic HTML code. The title will be expense tracker. Now for the body, what we are trying to achieve is we will have 3 buttons on the top, and we will have a container inside which we will have 4 internal containers to display different things. Although this is the UI part and we can all have different paths and different ideas on how we can show the information to the user. But for me, I am going with this technique, a container inside which I will have 4 containers. So let me put this in the HTML file. So the HTML will look something like this. Let me try to explain this. On the top, we will have a container, and then we will have header inside which we will have all the 3 buttons. Then we will have one internal container which will be element container, and inside this element container we will have income container divisions, then we have expense container divisions, then we have summary container divisions. So for income container, what we have is we have 2 internal containers for info and detail. So the upper 2 containers are for info and the lower 2 containers are for details. Now inside this we have 2 more internal containers, which is info add new, info summary, and for detail we are doing the same as detail category and detail recents. I'm just giving it a sub name, but we can use any name that we are comfortable with. And inside this we will have different HTML to add a form for heading, etc. Now this is very basic HTML. Let us put some CSS also for this. So I will make a new file, call it style.css, and here I'm going to just copy paste some CSS styling, which I'm sure is not the scope of this project. So copying all the styles, saving it, and including it in the index.html. Somewhere in the head section I can say link to CSS, and we have name also style.css, so nothing to change here. Let's save this and run it on the live server, which is an extension from VS Code, which you can surely check out. So if I right click and open with live server, it should open a browser, and we can see here that with our current CSS and HTML, we are getting 2 components that are completely blank and 2 smaller components which does not have any height and width, where we are going to put the charts in. Now before moving forward and putting anything here, I would like to make a script.js file also. So in our VS, I'll make a new file with script.js and include it in the HTML file. I can say script with source, and the source will be script.js. And what I'm going to do here is type is equal to module. Here one more thing is we can either make it async or we can make it differ. But I believe if we are keeping the script in the head tag, we should make it async. Why? Because we will be using some elements from the HTML file into our script, and if the script and HTML is not loaded, they will not be present in the script. So that's why we should always make it async, or at least keep it below the HTML code. Now, why we are keeping it a type of module? So in JavaScript, module means separating the code in different chunks and connecting them into a single file. So what we are going to do is we will be making a new file with income.js and one more file with expense.js. Now as we go along in code, we will keep our code for income separately into income.js, and we can keep our code for expenses into a different file. And finally, we can connect them into script.js. So first we will be looking at how we can make the income part of the expense tracker. So here I will be using class income. First we will make a constructor. Now at the start of the video, we were discussing about singleton design pattern related to object-oriented programming. So what is singleton design pattern? So singleton design pattern is nothing but it is used where only a single instance of a class is required to control the action throughout the execution. In basic terms, if we don't want many instances of this class to be used and initiating different constructor objects, then we want to make only a single instance and export it, or does not allow the consumer to make any more instances. In our case, how we can use this is, suppose we are into the income part of our expense tracker and we are initializing some budget plans. So we don't want the user to make new income plans or budget plans every time he is coming to the site. So we will be using the singleton approach here. Although this is not completely the correct usage of singleton approach, but in my understanding, this is a better approach here in our project, so we are going with it. So here I am going to do const income object is equal to new income, and here I am going to use export default income object. Make sure that we are exporting the income object, which is an instance of class, and not the class itself. So this is how we can kind of implement the singleton approach in our project. We will do the same with expense.js. Here I will say expense, and in place of income object I can say expense object new expense, and I am going to export the expense object. Now in our script.js, we will import those objects, which is a simple thing as importing. So we will import them here in our script.js. So this is how we can implement the singleton approach in our project. Although the approach is much bigger than this, but this is the gist of it. While we were focusing on the singleton approach, we also implemented one more thing, which is module-based JavaScript programming. So basically we have separated our code for expense and income in different files, and we are importing them in a single file, making different modules. So this is nothing but module-based JavaScript programming. Now let's start coding our income part of the tracker. For income, what will be my approach and how I am going to do it? I have a small plan ready with me before starting the project. So let me show you how I am planning to do it. So first of all, in my constructor, I will be having two things, that is income and budget, which will be the money, and this will be integer values. Then we have income categories and budget categories. We will get to this part very soon. Then I'm going to make some internal calculations, which is if I'm taking input from the income form, I will be storing them to the local storage. We can use a function for that, and there will be a function to get the local storage and basically the income and budget categories. Then I am going to have functions to add income, which is basically taking the input from form and adding it to our budget categories or income categories. Then I will have a function to calculate the final income and budget. When I say final income and final budget, basically from the form, from this income form, we will be getting the income and the source also, but we only want income to be added to the total income. so that we can get one final income amount. So we were talking about that. Then we will have one section where we will be interacting with the UI part of the website or the application. One will be taking the input from the form and using this add income to add our income to the income categories. Then we will do the same for budget also. We will take the budget from the application UI and put it into our local storage. Then we will populate all the budget data that we have in our backend or basically the local storage into a table. Then we will also have the functionality to remove budget row that we have added into the UI. And finally, we will have the provision to add income chart and the income budget compare chart. This we are going with chart.js, which is one library from JavaScript. We can surely explore it online. So in our constructor, let me define some variables. So for initial values, I am putting income, budget, income categories and budget categories as blank, and we will change them as we go along. Here I am adding two functions which will be necessary in the near future, which is set storage item and get storage item. These are nothing but basically we are setting something in our local storage and we are getting something from our local storage. So I'm making a different function for this because we will be using them at different part of the code. So just making a different function so that we don't have to repeat ourselves a lot. Now let me add the income form and the budget form into our HTML. So in my income container on the first block, I am adding a form which is a basic HTML form and one heading with add new income, so that our expense tracker can look something like this. Now what I will do is I will create a function in our class to capture these values. So in our income.js, after this, let me make a heading here which will be UI interactions, and I will say add income form, which we have already discussed that we were going to make. Inside this, the logic will be I will take the income from this input, source from this, or if this is available, we will take the new source. So the code for that will be, we will be getting one event here and we will use this to not submit the form immediately and wait for some time. So with this code, what we are doing is we will be preventing default, which is the submission of the form, and then we are getting the new income input, that is the input from our form. Then we have new source, which is the input for new source, and from the drop down we have existing source input. So what we are doing is to add a new income into our database or the local storage, we are checking if we have new source, then we will take the new source, otherwise we will take the source from the drop down. So if we have some income input, we will call this function which is add income, and we will send the income input and the source. Now it's turn to initialize this function into our class. But before that, let me comment this out, and we want to see what values we are getting here. So we need to bind this function to the form submission. For that, in our constructor, I will define the UI elements, and here I will take out the form using the ID. I can take the form using the income add form ID I have given it. So this is my form, and I can put event handlers here only. So I can say this dot income add form, and I can say add event listener, which will be submit. And for the function, I will say this dot the function which we have recently created, that is add income form, this dot add income form. And we should not forget that we need to bind the function with this so that we are always in the context of this class only. So using this, whenever we will be submitting the income add form, which is basically this form, so whenever we click on this button, this function will be invoked, which is add income form, which is nothing but we are taking the input and the source and we are sending it to the add income function, which is not present yet. So what we can do here is we can console.log. We can say these things which we are sending. Let's try it out. We can open our inspect tab, and here inside console we can ignore this error as of now because this is somehow coming for everything. I am not sure why, but for now we can ignore this. So if we put some income here, 1000, let's say salary, and we submit it here, in the info I'm getting 1000 and salary, which is the input and the source. So until here we can see that our input and the source, we are able to take it from the form. Now we are looking to add it into our local storage because we are using our local storage as a database. Coming back to our VS Code, let me comment this out and comment out this. So we need to add this method into our internal calculations part, which is nothing but here I can label it internal because these functions are not interacting with the UI at all. So here I will say this dot add income, making it a function. Sorry, I need to remove this. So this is just add income. So this will be taking two arguments, that is new income and the source. Here we are using our local storage as a database for our application. So this is something weird that we cannot alter any data into our local storage. So anytime we are trying to add a new source of data, we will fetch our data from local storage, add our new data into it, and we will all together send it again to the local storage with the same key so that we can replace it. So for that we will need to create a new array that can be a new category array, or we can call it anything. And the structure of our data that we want to save is we will be having one array. Inside that all the objects will be present with id, source and income. Id we don't have, but source and income we have from our new income and source. For the new id, what we can do is we can get the last id from our local storage, and we can add 1 to the id so that we can get the new id for our new object. And this method can be used in both income and the budget, so it's okay to make a new function for it. So what I'm going to do is I will use this line of code to get the last category id that is from the income categories, and I'm going to add 1 into this id. So to define this function, let me make a new function just below this, and what it is going to do is it will take this key and it will get me the last category id. And how we are doing that is, and how we are going to do that is, we will check into our local storage if we have something with the name of category name, or basically whatever we are sending from here. And if we have something, we will get the last item from that array and we will take out its id. And if we don't have that category into our local storage, we will return 0. We have already defined this get storage item above, which is basically we are getting something from our local storage. So all these functions are interrelated. Either we can make a complex function out of this, or we can separate them into different functions so that they can be used at different places and easily, and our code will also be simpler. So using this get last category id, we will get the last id, and adding 1 to this id, we will get the new id. Now our object is ready and we can push it. Now again, if we want to push this info into our local storage, we cannot alter the already existing information. So we need to get the information from local storage, add this category object into it, and then again send it to the local storage. So for that, first we will get the local storage item, which is income categories, and then we are going to add this object into the new category array and send it back. That can be done using this line of codes. So basically, if we have something in our local storage, we will use the spread operator so that we can spread these existing categories, and we are also adding our new object and making it an array. But if we don't have anything in our local storage, we will create a array with only this object inside it, and we will send it in the local storage. And to send this new category array into the local storage, we have a very simple command, that is set storage item. We are giving the key and the value, and we have already mentioned this earlier. So this is just setting the item with the key and value we are providing, and we are converting all the information into JSON so that we can easily manipulate it whenever we get it and we set it. Coming back to our add income method, after we have successfully pushed the item into the local storage, we are doing a location.reload so that we are reloading the page and we are getting all the fresh information. Although this is a bug, as we have understood in the beginning of the video, that can be resolved later, but for now this is good for us. So let's test it out. I will add some income here from YouTube. We are not getting any news source. I will submit it. There are no errors excluding this, so we are good. If we go into our application and check our local storage, we can see that in our income categories we have ID as 1, source YouTube, and income as 2000, which we have just entered. Now as we have something in our local storage, we can use that in our constructor for income categories. So I can just say this dot get income categories, and I can create a new function for this, and this method will just check the local storage, and if we have some income categories it will give us that information. So making it a method just below our last category ID, I can use this, and inside this it will be very simple. The logic is simple. If we have something in our local storage with the name income categories, we will return that. Otherwise, we will return an empty array. So this was for income. Now let's do the same for the budget. So for that, in our index.html, let me add the budget information form. So in my right hand side container, I'm just giving a heading of budget plan, and I'm making a table inside which there will be a small form kind of thing, but not exactly form. So this is the heading, and I have a small table with the headings category, amount, and action. So these are our two inputs, and these are button. So similar to what we did with the income, we will be tracking this category and amount, and on the click of this add button we will take these two and add into our budget and finally into our local storage. So the process is same. Let me show you how we can do it with the code. In income.js, in our constructor, just like we added this income add form using the ID, I will add another one which will be budget add button, which is nothing but the small add button we have on the right side. And before we add one event listener to this, let us create the function first. So in our UI interactions part, let me collapse all the methods. I will add a new method here that will be add budget form, so that it is similar to add income form. Here this will be a little bit simpler. So we will be taking the new budget category, and if we have some amount in the new budget, we will send this data to add budget function, which will basically get these two values and put it in the local storage. So let's define this also. Just below this income categories, I can say add budget. This will also take two arguments, new budget and new budget category. Inside this, it is pretty much same with the add income method. So this will look something like this. First of all, we are again making a new array so that we can manipulate this and push this back into the local storage. Then we are getting the last category ID, and this time we are using budget categories. And if we don't have any budget categories in our local storage, it will return as 0, and adding 1 will give us 1. Then again we are making a new object with this ID, category, and budget. Then we are getting the stored value from the get storage item, and if we have something from the local storage, we will use the spread operator to make a new array and then send it back to the local storage. or we will just push the new object into the array and put it into the local storage using this set storage item. And finally, we are using the reload function so that we are reloading our page and get the fresh information. Now we have the method that will interact with the UI and take information, and we have the method that will take that extracted information and put it to the local storage. Now we just need to add one event listener to the add button. So for that, if we go to our event handlers, we can say this dot budget add button dot add event listener, and this time we can directly make it on click, and this will be this dot add budget form, and we should never forget to bind this with the current context of the object. So this should work. So let's try it out. In our browser, if I put some category, let's say fuel, and I'm putting some amount of 250 and click on add, it is doing something, and let's see if we have some error. No error. If we check our application local storage, we can see now we have budget categories with id 1 category fuel and budget as 250, which we just used here. So this is working fine. Now we can use this budget categories to be included in our constructor. Basically, we could have used it earlier, but now we have something to get. So in our constructor, just below this budget categories, I can just copy this, paste it here, and instead of income, I can say budget categories. And again, this budget categories method will be very similar to get income categories, and that will look something like this, where we are just getting the item from the local storage, else returning an empty array. One query here can be, why do we need these categories? So we need these categories so that we can go through each of the category budget or category income, and we can get one final budget amount or the income amount. So for that purpose, we will need these budget categories from the local storage. There are more than one ways we can achieve one thing. So maybe my method is lengthy and complex, and maybe you can come up with a new and optimized method. So it's better to always try it on your own first and then look for tutorials online. Now we can add our income and our budget into our local storage and we can get it. What we need to do next is, just like in our demo, we are having this category and amount and action into our table. So we are going to do this now. We will fetch the local storage and populate these categories and amount into this table. For that, in our index.html, let us see how our table is designed. So in our table, we have table head and we have our table body, and we have just one row with the input and add button. So what we can do is, inside our body, we can add some more rows on top of this row. So for that, in our income.js, let me make a new method in UI interactions part, and I can call this map budget table or something like that. This will be a simpler logic. So first of all, I am using this dot budget categories from constructor, which is here. So I'm getting all the budget categories from the local storage. And now we can see how easy it is to make different methods, smaller methods, to do our work. So we have this dot budget categories, and we are looping through each of them using for each. And inside this, we are creating one element, which is the row tr, giving it an id, which is basically b row, and the item.id, which we have inside the budget categories. And this id will be used to delete the budget row. And inside this tr, we are just using td basically to put data into our row. And as you can see here, for the button, I am also giving the id, which is similar to the budget row. This row id will be equal to the button id, and this will be helpful in deleting the complete row. And finally, using this income budget table body, which we have not defined it in the constructor yet, and I will add the adjacent element into our body. So let's define this into our constructor. In our constructor in UI elements for budget table body, I'll again use the same get element by id command. Now everything is ready, but we are not using this method anywhere and we are not calling it anywhere. So let me create a method here that will say initiate, and here I will put this, so that whenever we are calling income object dot initiate, it will automatically call this function, and the budget categories, if we have any, will be put into the table. Now again, we are not calling this method anywhere, so we will go to script.js, and here I will say income object dot initiate. So since script.js will run, it will import this income object and this will call the initiate. So let's see if it is working. And in our browser, we can see that we have fuel of 250. Now let's try to add something else. Let's say food, I want 3000 budget, and add it. It will reload and it is adding into our table. Okay, since we are in the budget plan now, so we want to delete this and this row should be deleted. So let's add that method now. So in our income.js, we will collapse this, and inside this or below this, we will say remove budget row. Am I planning to bind this to a button? So I will take one event here to check which button is pressed, and inside this I can use this code to check that and see which row needs to be deleted. So basically I am taking the ID of the button which is pressed. So overall what we are doing is we are extracting the ID from the button ID, and we are using this ID to get the row ID. Then we are getting the row using this ID we have for row. And finally, we are removing the row from the UI as well as from the backend using remove item function, which we will be defining in a moment. So to make things simpler, let me console log something. Here I will console log the button ID, and after that, let me console log the row ID, which is budget row ID, and let's see what do we get. So in our console, in our info part, if we click on it, nothing is happening, and the reason for that is we have not defined this in our constructor and we have not added any event listener to this button. So let's do it. In our constructor, which is this one, I will take the UI for the table because it is efficient to add one click event listener to a table than to add the same event listener to all the buttons. This is something to optimize in our code, so I am doing it. Now on this budget table in our event listeners, I will add one event listener that will be on click, and that will be this dot remove budget row, and again binding it to the current context of the object. So binding this, this should be bind. Now our function should work. Let's try it out again. So if I click on delete for the first row, we are getting the button ID as bud delete button 1. So we are splitting this complete part to get the ID as 1, and then we are using this to get the row ID, which is b row 1. Now we know that we need to delete the budget row 1. Now we can see in the UI this has been deleted, but if we go to our application and local storage, in our budget categories we can see that we have fuel of 250 rupees still in our local storage. So why is this happening? In our code, if you remember, we commented out one line, that is remove item. because we have not initialized it yet, but we did not comment out the budget row dot remove, hence it is deleted from the UI. Now let's remove this console log from here and comment out this, and let's create a new method remove item in our internal calculations, and it is taking two arguments, basically what category and the ID. So we will make two arguments here, and inside this method what we will be doing is, first of all, we will be taking the category name. So basically item plus categories. So here we are saying budget. So we will be making it budget categories. And then we are getting this data from our local storage. After that, we are making a new array, filtering out the item that we need to delete. And finally, again, setting this data into our local storage. And after that, reloading the page. So this should delete our item from local storage, and inside our previous method budget row dot remove should remove it from the UI. So basically doing what we needed. So if we check it out on browser, if I click on fuel 250 delete, we can see that it is deleted from the UI. If we check console, there are no errors. And again, if we go to application and local storage, we can see that in our budget categories, we have one thing, that is category as food and budget of 3000 rupees. So this is how we can add new income, add new budget, and delete new budget. Now the final thing in our income tracker is to add the charts here. So for that we have something known as chart.js. We can use this to include charts in our JavaScript file. So we can go to get started. We can go through all the process. So first of all, we need to get the CDN. We can copy the CDN from here. In our index.html, we can go to the top, and before we include our script.js, we need to include the script, because we will be using some classes from this chart.js in our script.js. So we need to put it above the script.js script. Now there are many things from chart.js that are wonderful. Like if we go to this and we can say chart types, we have different types of chart: area chart, bar chart, bubble chart, etc. But for our case, we use donut and pie chart. And for the configuration is something like this. So we will have a config and the setup. So let me show you the basic setup of this. After we have included the script in our HTML file, we can go to income.js and we can create a new function here, that is income chart, or maybe something else. For the chart to work properly, we will need two things: the labels and the data. Labels to basically show what the data is for, and the data is the main data we want to show. Now to populate these arrays, I'm using this .income categories that we are getting from the backend or the local storage, and I'm extracting label and data from this item, basically the source and income. And also what I'm doing here is I'm creating a row. So basically on top of our chart, we will also see what is the source and what is the income. Now we have this income label and data. What we need to do is we need to start configuring our chart. For that, the data required for the chart will be something like this. The labels we need to provide, which is income labels, and in the data sets we can provide more than one data set if we are trying to make more than one donut chart. So for our case, we are only using one data set, and inside that data we are giving the income data. This is just the background color. We can change it, or we can give one for all, or we can do anything we want with this color. So this is the data for our chart. Now if we go for the configuration of the chart, it will look something like this. So the type of chart we want is donut. Data we have already defined it here. the options, we can have different options like responsiveness, what the position of the legend should be, what should be the title, etc. Now we have our data and config. After that, what we need to do is we need to simply use this command or the line of code, which is new chart. Basically we are using a class from our in chart.js, and we are using this configuration to put the chart data into this UI component. So let us define this UI component in our constructor. Below this, I can say this dot income chart is this one, and if we check, this is what is required. Okay, now let's check our browser. For our expense tracker, we see that nothing happened. If we check our console, there's nothing wrong here. So let's debug what's going wrong. We have this in our constructor. The config is good. The data is good. Okay, I think we missed to initiate this. So income chart table body. So let's add this into our constructor. This should work now. If we refresh again, something is still going wrong. So if we look at the code again, okay, I think what we are missing is inside our index.html, we did not add the HTML for the chart container. So this is the above container. Inside our detail, which is the below container, we don't have the required HTML. That's right. So we need to create a canvas so that we can put our chart into it. So in our income.js, we are getting the element by ID of income chart. So this is nothing but canvas. So inside our index.html, we need to add a table and a canvas. So for that, I will add a table and one canvas with the ID of income chart. Let's save this and test it out again. In our browser, we can see that we have something here, but it is not showing. If we try to refresh, it is still not coming. What could be going wrong here? And the reason for that could be in our code. If we check our function or method, this is good. Okay, I know what's going wrong. So we have never called it. So income chart inside our initiate, I will say this dot add income chart, or basically income chart. But there is another reason here that this is conflicting with this. So we need to change the method name here. So let's call it add income chart method, and we can paste it here. Save it and let's try it out. And voila, it is giving us the chart. So let's try to add one more source here. So let's say 5,000, and let's try to add a new source here, and I can say freelance. Submit. It should give us a new chart, and yes, it is giving us. Now let's add one more chart here, which will compare the budget to our total income and give us the savings. For that, we will collapse this one and make a new method here, add income budget compare chart, a lengthy name but necessary. And inside this method, first of all, as I have done with the income chart, let me add something in a table that will basically show what is the budget of all the categories. After this, let me make some data for my chart, which will look something like this. Let me try to explain this. The labels will be income/budget. So I'm just using one label here. And as we were discussing in the last chart, that we can add different data sets. So for our data sets, I am using an array of object for basically different things. For income, I am using this dot income. For budget, I am using this dot budget. And for savings, I am using this dot savings. We have different border color, background color, etc. And these things savings, budget and income we are taking from the constructor. So income, budget and savings. Now this dot income is blank, so we need to put some value here that we will be putting in a minute. But first let's configure our chart completely. So in our comparison chart we have 3 data sets. After this we will need to make a config for our chart, which will look something like this. So the type of chart we need is bar type. We already have the data above. We have different options and we have the title as income budget comparison. And finally after this we will initiate the chart using this. So we need to include this in our constructor, not making the same mistake again. We can get it using this, and we need to add HTML also for this. So inside our index.html, inside this division we can add one table and also the chart. So we have our table and we have our canvas. Now going back to our income.js again, we have our things ready. So we need to add the table income budget comparison table also in the constructor. So that will be something like this. This is nothing but the table we just added. We can check here. Now we need to put this function or method into our initialization or initiate method. So this dot the method, and it will run itself. Now before testing it out on the browser, we forgot to add 2 things, which are basically to get the total income and the total budget. For that we can create new functions here. That will be this dot calculate category, and we can pass we want to calculate income. Now this method is somewhat easy. We can get the defined category like income category from the local storage, and we can reduce all the income into one variable. So let's define it on the top. It will look something like this. So we will see if we have the category in the local storage. We will reduce it to get the final income of the user. Otherwise we will return 0. And we can do this same thing with the budget also. So this will give us the budget also. We can copy this, paste it here, and instead of income I can say budget. Now everything should be okay. If we check our chart function, we are using here this dot income. This is done, budget is done, savings is also done. Now let's test it out on the browser, and here we can see that our income is somewhere about 7,000, which is 5,000 plus 2,000, and our expense or budget is somewhere about 3,000 here, and we can see it on top also. And finally the savings can be around 4,000, which is 7,000 minus 3,000 is 4,000. One last thing that is left in this section is estimated savings. We need to put a value here. So for this, in our HTML we already have this row and we already have the span with the ID. So let's initiate this in our constructor and put the value using any of the method. So in our income.js constructor, I can put here saving value, which is nothing but getting element by the ID, and let me use the last method that we have defined to put the value inside this span. So this will be nothing but the saving value component of the UI, and its text content will be equal to this dot savings. In the browser we can see now we have the estimated savings as 4,000 rupees, which is 7,000 minus 3,000, 4,000, and also chart is also similar to the information we have. So this is how we can make the income part of the total expense tracker we are going to make. To summarize, first of all, we added a method to grab all the information from the form and put it in the local storage. Then we use the same technique for budget, and after that we populated the budget in a table. And we have also utilized the chart.js functionality or the library from internet and display these charts that we can see on the screen. With this, I conclude this part of the video, and in the next video we will see how we can design the expense part of the total tracker. In this part we will see how we can code the expense part of the video. So in our expense part, what we need to do is we need to first add one form that will take the amount and the tag, and this tag is actually the budget we have defined in the income part: food, gift, fuel and misc. In the expenses we will get all this as a drop down. This is one thing. Then we need to list down all the transactions that we have done. Then we need to create a bar graph kind of thing where we are showing how much we have already exhausted of the budget. And finally we will create a chart of all our expenses. So let's get started. First of all, in our index.html, for our income container that is here, I will provide one class that will be hidden, so that this container will be hidden for now. And just like this, I will make a new container which will be expense container. Since we are required to use only JavaScript, we need to do all this stuff, but using some framework like React and Angular, this will be pretty easy. So let me put the HTML for expense container. The HTML will look something like this. Again, we will have two outer divisions, info and detail. Inside this we have two containers to show different things. On the browser, in our tracker, we can see that we have the form, and in drop down we don't have anything. We have a simple heading with the table, but we don't have any content. Same here, and we don't have any chart. So basically we have provided all the placeholders as of now, and we will start populating them and using them with the help of JavaScript. So in our expense.js, first thing what we need to do is we need to import the income object. We are importing this because we are using budget from income.js as a drop down into our expense. So we need this. So we will say this dot tags, or basically we can call them anything, but this is nothing but the budget we have already prepared. So I can say this dot income object, or basically income object dot budget categories. Then we need this dot expense or expenses, and this we will get from storage item. So I can use the same thing we have in our income object, that is get storage item, and here we are using the key as expenses. Now let's make some simple internal calculation methods, and some of the basic ones which are already used in income.js are set storage item, basically storing the item in JSON form into our local storage, then getting the storage item from our local storage, and basically getting the last tag ID. From our local storage we will get the array, and from the last array we will get the ID, otherwise we will get 0. So these methods are already defined in income.js, so these are very similar. We can again go a bit deeper, and we can maybe define this function once in a different class and use that into both our classes, but not going into that much detail. We can keep them into separate classes of their own. Now the first thing that we want to do is we need to get all the budget from here, or basically the budget name, category name from this budget categories, and populate it into our new expense form, which is basically this drop down. So let's do it first. So below this, let me put a heading of UI interaction, so that we are clear what function or what method is doing what. And here I can say add budget drop down, and here what we are going to do is we will take out the category name from each of the budget categories that we are getting from income object, and we will put that into an option as a drop down. We can use these line of codes. First of all, we will see if we have any categories or not. If we have, Then we will go through each one of them and we will take out the category and put it as a value and text on an option, and we can insert this into our expense drop down HTML element. And for that, let us include it into the constructor. Also, we will collapse these which are not required as of now. I will say UI elements or UI components. This dot drop down will be equal to basically taking out the element using ID. So this ID can be checked in our index.html as this one. Like we have this ID for the select, and inside select we are putting the options. So we have initialized it. We have our method. So we need to create one initiate method here, initiate, and here we need to call it so that this can be run whenever we are opening our expense tracker. We need to add this dot. Now we need to run this initiate into our main script.js along with expense object dot initiate, and this should be working fine now, but this is not coming. Let's see if we have any error. This is some kind of error, so let's see. This is coming from here. Let's check our code once. This is fine. In our expense.js import income object. Okay, I think the reason could be we need to add income.js. If we check again, and yes, it is giving us the correct drop down. In our income, we know that we have only used food as a budget category, so we are only getting food as a drop down. Now the next step is to take out this input and this tag and add a new transaction. So basically how much we have spent from this category. For that, we will add the expense form in our UI elements in constructor, and also we will add event handlers here only. This dot expense form dot add event listener. On submit, we will give the name of add expense form, and we need to bind the method with the context of the current class, so we are using bind. Now let's create this method in the UI interaction part. If I create this one, this will take one event as we are binding it to a form, removing the this. Now we need to prevent the default submission of the form, and we need to perform some activities using JavaScript. It is quite simple. We will prevent the default, and we will take the input, and we will take the tag from the drop down, and we will send it to the add expense method of this class. So commenting this out and console.log what we are getting here. Let's try it out. If I enter an amount of 100 which I placed on food and submit, in our info section I can say that we are getting the correct information, which is 100 and food. Now we can send this to the method to add it into our local storage. Delete this, uncommenting this. We need to add this as a method which will be here. It is basically the same thing that we did for income. We will create a new array, we will create a new object, we will check with the local storage. If we already have something, we will attach this new object to the local storage item, and we will again send it to the local storage as a complete thing. The code will look something like this. So again we are making a new array. We are getting the last tag ID using the method we have already made, and we are creating a new object with the new transaction. Then we are getting the local storage item, and if we have something, we will use the spread operator and add the new object into the array and send it as a whole back to the local storage. Otherwise we will send one array with the current object into the local storage, and at final stage we will reload the page. Again making a to-do item here so that we are all aware we need to change this or we need to do something about this. It's a bug, need to change it. So let's try it out again. I will enter amount of 150 into food, and if I submit and check the application, nothing is happening, nothing in the console as well. So let's check where we missed. in the add expense form, we are preventing the default add expense, getting to arguments in the add expense. So we do not define the two arguments here, so we need to do that. We can keep it as new expense and the tag. Let's try it out again. Let me give a transaction of 120 into food. Submit. This is reloaded, and if we go to application, I can see that we have expenses as ID1, tag food, and expense of 120. So this is working fine. Now we have something into our expenses. So let's put it in our constructor. So we have already initialized this as get storage item of expenses. So we are already getting whatever we have from local storage as expenses. This is good. Now the next thing that we need to do is, in our browser we can see we have a table where we need to list all the transactions with the latest one on the top. So we can do this, but for this we need to add some more categories or budget into our income. For that, what we need to do is, as of now in our index.html we have used the hidden class to hide our income container. So we will remove it from here and we will put it in the expense container, so that we are working with one thing at a time. In the future we will be using these buttons to show different pages. As of now we can stay at the same. So let me add some more budget. For fuel I'll add a budget of 3000, or let's say 1500. For gifts I can say 1000 rupees. This should be enough. Removing hidden from expense and putting it into income. Okay, first let's make some transactions. So I'll say 150 for fuel, 200 for gift, then 100 again for food, 120 again for fuel. And we can see here in the local storage we have some transactions to show. Now we can move ahead. In our expense.js we will initialize the table that we have on the right side of our web browser, or better we can add it into the method itself. So for our UI interaction, let me make a new function with get all expenses. The code will look something like this. First of all, we are taking this dot expenses basically from local storage and we are sorting them. We are sorting them with the help of sort method we already have for arrays. Let me comment all this out and show you how the sorted arrays will look like. So in our local storage we can see that first we have food, fuel, fuel. But if we check our console, we don't have anything. That is because we have not included this into our initiate function. So we can say this dot initiate the get all expenses method. Now if we check out, we have array with fuel, fuel and food, which is basically the opposite of what we have here. And this we are doing because we want to show the latest one on the top. After this we are taking out the expense body from the HTML using ID. Then we are initializing the serial as 1, because the ID of the last transaction will be the oldest ID, which is if we have 4 transactions the ID will be 4. So we are not using the item ID here. And from sorted expenses, what we are doing is we are inserting adjacent HTML, which is an HTML method, and we are putting each of the row after another. If we have 4 transactions, we will put the 4th one on top, 3rd one below 4th one, 2nd one below 3rd one. Basically we are trying to put new element below each other. So that's why I am using the position as before and the serial as 1 2 3 4. So we will have the serial correct 1 2 3 4, but the transactions will be opposite. So if we check our browser, here we can see that we have 1 2 3 4 serials. We are not using the item ID from this transaction, and we have these things as the latest one. In our application local storage, we can see that fuel 120 is the last one, which is on the top. With this done, now we can move on to the next part, which is we are showing here a bar graph kind of thing where we are showing how much is the exhausted amount. So for that, what I am doing is, first of all, we have the category. So the category name will be simple name. For expense, let me show you the HTML for it. In our index.html expense container, in our detail, we have a table with the table head as category expense. For table body, we are keeping it blank and we will be doing it from JavaScript. So let me define the method first and then explain you what we are doing. It will be easier to understand then. So in our expense.js, collapse this. Let me define a function here that will be get category expenses list. So basically we are getting a list of for what category, what is the total expense. Here I'll be defining two things first. One will be expense list. Now this is a little tricky, so let me try to explain this. With this method, what I'm trying to do is, if we check our local storage, we have transactions differently. Like for food, we have 120 different. Again for food, we have 100 different. So with the help of that method, what we are trying to do is, for food, how much we have totally spent. So it should be 120 plus 100, so 220. And for the fuel, same thing. So this method will give us that thing. And this is a little more complicated. So let me create a new method for it. Here again, the point is there are more than one ways to get one thing, but I will be using the JavaScript function of reduce to get the desired output. The function will look something like this. So we have this dot expenses, and in the constructor we can see that we have all the expenses from our local storage. Now we are reducing it. In the reduce function, we all know that there is something known as accumulator. So I'm initializing it with an empty array. So if we have our current expense into our accumulator, then what I'm doing is we are adding that amount into the already existing object. If we don't have that expense in our accumulator, we are adding the object as a fresh input here. So this is basically a simple reduce function that will give us an array where we will have one category and all the expenses calculated for that category. So in our previous method, if we try to console log this, let's see what do we get. But before that, we need to add it into our initiate with this keyword. Checking our browser, in our console, we can see that we have an array of two objects, which is fuel 270 rupees and food 220 rupees, as we have discussed. And along with the total expense into this category, we also have the total budget of this category, so that we can see how much is utilized out of how much. Okay, now we have how much and we have the total. Now we need to find a way to show this into a visual form. So what we can do is we will create a outer division and we can create one inner division. So the outer division will be at a fixed scale or fixed width, and we can use the inner division to show the percentage of expense we have already exhausted. This is again quite tricky, so let me put it into the code. So the code will look something like this. Let me try to explain it from the top. As I was saying, we will have one external division with a constant width, and after that, for each of the item into this expense list that we have just created, we will create a row which will have the item column, which is basically the name of the category. Then we will have the column of exhaust, which will show how much is exhausted, and then we have the total column, which will show the number, which is the total budget. And in this part of the code, we are just doing the outer division and the inner division thing. I'm not going into much detail, at least for this part, because each person will have a different ideology in thinking and they can come up with their own and better solution for this thing. Anyways, the code will be present in the description as a resource, so we can always take a reference from this. Now for each of the item in the expense list, I'm putting the tag, the exhausted division percentage, and the total of the budget. So let's see how this is looking in our browser. Yeah, so in our browser we can see that on the first column we have food. In the second we have two divisions. One is the fixed length or fixed width division, out of which we will take the percentage which is exhausted from the total amount, and we will take the width of the inner element as such. So this is how we can visually show how much is exhausted out of the total budget. The last thing we need to add here is a chart to show what is our expense. So adding our chart is quite simple. We have already seen in the income part of the tracker. If you have not seen it, please have a look at the previous video. The method will look something like this. Explaining it from the top. First we have expense list. So basically what we have extracted in our previous method, that is for each item how much we have already exhausted. We already have a function for this. Now we need label and data for our chart. So from this expense list we can take out the labels and data, and the data is quite simple to modify. We need to add labels in place of labels and data in place of data. The background colors can be different or same, that is as per the requirement. Now for the chart configuration, we are looking for a donut type of chart. The data we have just initialized, and we can have some other options as well. The title will be expense categories. And finally, we are doing this with the constructor of new chart, and we are using this dot expense chart that is already a canvas ID. We need to define this into our constructor. So going on the top in our UI elements, we can say this dot expense chart is equal to document dot get element ID by expense chart. This should be good now. Okay, we can add this into our initiate, this dot get expense chart. This should be working fine. Let's check our browser, and we can see here we have our chart already up. So this is how we can do the expense part of our complete expense tracker. So to summarize, first of all we extracted the amount and the category on which the expense is made. We populated all the transactions with the latest one on top into a division. Then we have shown how much we have exhausted out of the total budget we have for that category. And finally we have the chart for our expenses. With this I conclude this part of the video here. In the next video, that will be the last part of making this expense tracker, we will see how we can make the summary page and how we can use these buttons to see different tabs of our expense tracker. In the last part, we have seen how to make the income part of the tracker and the expense part of the tracker. This is rather a simple video where we are just taking parts from the income and expense and putting it as a summary. So the summary will look something like this. First we will have the budget plan, then we will have how much we have exhausted, then we will have income chart and the expense chart. We have already defined all of these things in the respective expense and income tracker. So first of all, what we are going to do is, if we click on this, we should go to the respective tab. So let's add this first. In our index.html, I will hide my expense tracker and my income tracker, and I will make a new container that will be summary container. The HTML is very simple. We will have 4 parts. The above 2 will have tables and the below 2 will have charts. The HTML will look something like this. Going from the bottom, we have canvas for expense chart, canvas for income chart. Then we have category expenses where we will show how much is exhausted, and we are also adding a division for showing total savings that we have. Then for the first division we have budget plan, for which category how much is allocated. So with this completed, let's go to our script.js, and here we will be making a new class that will be tracker, and this will be the main tracker. Here if I make a constructor, if I am making a class, this should not come. Then inside our constructor I will initialize this. So basically this dot income object is equal to income object. This dot expense object is equal to expense object. Now what I will do is, on our browser we already are on the summary page, so we will have three divisions, one for summary, one for expense, one for income. Also we will have three buttons, summary, expense and income. So there are two things we need to take care of. If we are clicking on summary, this division should be showing and rest two should be hidden, and also the red button, which is the CSS, it should be transferred to this one. So to handle these two, we need to get some UI elements. These elements will contain income button, expense button, summary button and their respective divisions. And I am making an array of these things so that I can loop through them. Now to handle showing off each tab on the individual click, I can say show tab, and I will be binding to all these buttons. So I can say, if I add event handlers here, for all the three buttons, I will add one event listener that will be click, and we never forget to bind the context of this class to that particular event. So that is one thing done. Now we are getting this on click, so I will take one event handler here, event here. Since this is invoked on click event, so I will take one event here. So inside this method, I will use this code, which is basically I am taking out the ID of each of the button. So whenever we are clicking on the button, we will take out the ID, which is, let's say for summary button, we have summary button. Then we will take out the button from the equation and we will have just summary. And using this, I can see which one of the container should be visible. So I can take summary and put one string that is container to it, and we can get the respective division. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm taking out the ID, splitting it with the string of button and taking out the first letter and adding the container. So here we will have, if I click on summary button, I will get summary container. Then I will look through each of these divisions and I will see whose ID is similar to what we have pressed. So if they match, I will remove the hidden class from them. Otherwise, I will add the hidden class to them. So if summary button is clicked, I will take out the summary string from here, add container, so it will become summary container. So the summary container block will have the hidden class removed, and other two divisions will have the hidden class added to the division. So this way I can show the respective tab on click. This is about showing off the division. Now the CSS of the button should also be moved for the active tab. So for that is a simple code. So I'm looping through all of these buttons, and if that button's ID is equal to the ID that is pressed, we are adding the class of active tab. Otherwise we are removing the class. So this is quite simple. Let's test it out. We are on the summary page. If I click on expense, so if I click on expenses, it should go there, but it is not going. So let us see what's going wrong. Okay, we have our class, constructor, method linked to the add event listener. Okay, we have not used this class, so I can say const tracker is equal to new tracker. This should run now. So let's check again. If I click on expenses, okay, we are coming to the expenses page, and for income page. If I click on summary, we are coming on the summary. Now let's add this budget plan. That will be very similar to what we have done in the income.js for our budget list. So if we check map budget table, we are making a row and we are adding HTML to it, but this time we will not be adding the delete button. So taking this as a reference, in our script.js, if I make a new method that will be get budget list, the code will look something like this. So we are taking the budget categories from this .income object .budget categories. We are using the object of the income class to get the budget categories. Then for each of these budget categories, I am creating a row, and then we are adding the category and the budget without any delete button. Let's check this out. But before that, we need to put this into one method which will be run on every render, we can say. So I will say initiate, and here I will put this, adding this dot. And what I will do is I will take this and initiate it here, as this is the main script.js tracker.initiate. Okay, this will initiate the tracker class, and inside this we will initiate the respective income and expense classes. So inside this initiate, we need to also put income object.initiate and expense object.initiate. So putting them here using this, adding this to this also, removing them from the top. Now let's try it out. We are not getting anything, so let's see what's the issue. In our console, errors, cannot read properties of undefined script.js 45. Okay, this is not available, and the reason is probably we did not initialize it in our constructor. So let's check it out, and yes, we have not. So I will copy this in our constructor. I can use the id to get this, and now it should be working fine. And on our summary page, we can see that it is working fine. But before that, let me correct one more thing. If we refresh, this is coming back to the income. So we need to put the active tab on the summary first. In our index.html, where we have buttons, which is here, active tab I will remove from income button and put it on the summary button. And now we can see we are on the summary page, and it is indicated by this tab also. Now what we will do is we will take out this table and put the UI for this division. So we will just copy paste and put it inside a new division here. In our script.js, let me initialize one more table here, that is summary category expense. And if we check, we have this in our summary part, summary budget. So here it is. Coming back, we have the UI. Now we need to make a method for it, collapse, and this method will be very similar to what we have already done in expense. I have literally copy pasted it, but with one change, that is I am putting the elements into this division now. And in our expense.js, into get category expenses list, and we can see only this part is changed. So in our script.js, this is done. We need to put this into our initiate method with the addition of this. Now it should work. Let's see. And voila, it's working. Now we can add total savings into our summary page, and we can do it in script.js itself. So if I make a new function here, that will be get savings. Inside here, I will use these lines of code. Basically, I'm taking income from the income class, and I'm taking the expense from the expense class, and I'm just doing income minus expense. So that will give me my saving. And I'm taking the saving span from the HTML and putting the text content of saving into it. So this is quite simple. I will copy this, paste it into my initiate, and in my browser I am not getting anything because it says income object get total expense is not a function. Let's check it out. Get total expense from expense.js, expense chart. Okay, I think we missed to create the function here. So let me create the function here. That will be get total expenses or expense. And here what I am going to do is I will just go through each of the expense that we have done and calculate the total amount, which will be something like this. Now it should work. And here we can say that we have the total savings also available with us. Now comes the more easiest part, which is adding the charts here. So what we can do is for income chart, we can go to income constructor, and here we will initialize one more element that will be summary income chart, and taking out by ID of the respective canvas on summary page. Now I will take this, and in my chart making function here, which is add income chart, just below this I will say const my chart to new chart this dot summary income chart, and I will use the same config, and this should be working fine because we are using the same index.html file in all of the JS files. Let's check it out. And here, if we close our console, we can see that income chart is clearly visible, and we can do the same with expense chart also. In our expense.js, if I go to the constructor, if I add a new UI here, which will be summary expense chart, again by taking the ID from the summary canvas of expense chart, and I will copy this, go to the chart function here, that is get expense chart, and below the my chart I will say my chart 2, and this will be new chart on this dot summary expense chart using the same config. This should be fine now. Let's see. And on our browser we can see we have our expense chart available with us. By this we can say that our expense tracker is functional, although we do not have all the functionalities that expense tracker should have. But taking this as a hobby project, this is a good tracker, and we got to learn a lot of things about it. So this proves to be a good project for us. A last look at the tracker, we can see that we have budget plan and the other summary on the summary page. We have expenses with a chart on our page. Then we have income with different charts and easily adding income sources, budget plans, etc. With this, I conclude that we have successfully created one expense tracker, and this tracker has different parts like adding income, budget plan, tracking all the expenses, summary for all the incoming and outgoing money, etc. I hope you liked the video. Please let me know your thoughts in the comment section. If you liked the video, please hit the like button. And if you are coming here for the first time, please do hit the subscribe button, and do not forget to push the notification bell to not miss out any videos in the future. We will meet very soon with a new video. Until then, this is Somveer taking your leave. Adios.